Thank you very much. Appreciate that informed introduction, which is rare from my experience in giving this presentation. I should apologize off the bat for bringing my Boston weather with me, and I did expect a little better than this, but I think I must have carried it in with me. I should start by saying most of you, or many of you, probably have seen the movie Lincoln, the Steven Spielberg movie. Can I get a little show of hands? Okay, almost unanimous. You may recall that there's a kind of a subtext in that film about a negotiation between Lincoln and three leaders of the Confederate government toward the very end of the Civil War, which is the subject of the book. And as Skip mentioned, rooting around for something to write about as I was winding down my legal career and getting back to what I'd always wanted to do. It was hard to come up with something that had not been written about Lincoln and the Civil War, which has always been of great interest to me. I started the project well before Spielberg did. It took me 4.5 years to write the book. My wife told me it was longer than it took to fight the Civil War, which is true. But all of that said, I do want to get into this right away and get as much as we can in. It's a long story, and it has to be compressed in a short period if we're going to get through the highlights of it. Only thing I want to say before I get started, most, not all, but almost all of the slides in the presentation are colorized Civil War photography. Not done by me, but by a fellow who does this for a living and was kind enough to let me use these slides. I think you'll see that they add, a reality to photographs that many of us have seen before, and certainly to the people that we see in black and white who kind of snap to life, like coming from Kansas to Oz when the door opens up and it turns into color. So all of that said, let me get started. This is a photograph taken of Lincoln fairly early in his administration. And I think you can see that although he made many jokes, and others did, about his appearance, he's a vigorous, healthy, confident man in his mid-50s at the time the Civil War began. At the time of the Hampton Roads Peace Conference in February of 1865, we can see what 4 years of Civil War had done. By the way, before I continue, can we knock down the lights a little bit? There'll be a better. Great. We can go all the way down if you can. Is that against the fire laws or anything? Okay, great. After 4 years of Civil War, you can see the toll that experience had taken on him. As most of us know from our reading and otherwise, Lincoln's primary goal when the war began was to preserve the Union. The abolition of slavery was an evolving element of that really didn't take hold until well into the war. But by the time of the Hampton Roads Peace Conference in February of 1865, the war was effectively won, at least in terms of conventional battle and conventional war. There was fear that there might be some kind of prolonged guerrilla war, basically a kind of an insurgent, reconcile the two parts of the country, reunite the country, and somehow get over this trauma of this horrific event that had consumed both sides of the conflict for these past 4 years. This is a contemporary map done at the time that shows you the area is kind of greenish that was either Union states or Union-controlled territories. The sort of yellowish area is former Confederate territory that had by this time been occupied by Union forces, controlled by Union forces. And as you can see, what's left of the Confederacy in that sort of pinkish salmon color is divided in two. There's no communication between one side and the other, no telegraph wires, no ground or water transportation, no military contact. So basically, you've cut the South in two by this time. You've conquered most of the productive cities, most of the richest farmland. The coastal area, if your eyes are a little better than mine, you can see that the coastal area is largely yellow as well. And in fact, by this time, every seaport that the Confederacy had was also under Union control. So there was no trade with the outside world, no shipments of arms, uniforms, food, and the rest. So by the time February of 1863 comes along, you've really got the Confederacy on the ropes militarily. And although Confederate armies had generally outfought the Union armies in most of their encounters, they had been worn down by the sheer weight of numbers and the industrial power and the wealth of the North as compared to the resources of the South. At this time, however, there was still doubt about the will of the Southern people to continue this war, even though these were the facts that were staring everybody in the face. It had only been a few months before this that General William Tecumseh Sherman had conducted his infamous or famous, depending on what side you're on, march to the sea from Atlanta. Sherman had not acted alone. He and Lincoln and Grant and others had formed a deliberate policy to work their way through the civilian South as well as the military South in a deliberate effort to kind of break the will of the Southern people to fight this war. Sherman said at one point that before he began his march that it was his intention to go into what he called the very bowels of the South and cut a swath that would still be visible 50 years hence. I'm told by people who've seen it that some of that swath is still visible 150 years hence. Grant, as well as Sherman, had come up with this plan of what Grant at one point called sanguinary war, bloody war, that, in the first 3 or 4 years of this conflict, there had been these kind of indecisive battles, a sort of ebb and flow, one way or the other. After a major battle was won, that the sides tended to retire to their corners, recover, rest up, have another battle, switch generals on the northern side in particular, and sort of prolong this thing without the decisive conflict. Grant was determined to bring this war to an end and to grapple with Lee and his army until it was over, no matter how many casualties it took to do that. Part of that plan was not only the destruction of armies, although that was the primary goal, but also, as I said, the sort of disillusionment or morale breaking of the civilian population as well. These mortars, these massive mortars, were brought down from Connecticut by rail outside of Petersburg, Virginia, where Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was dug in opposite Grant's Army of the Potomac for 9 months in a sort of trench warfare foretelling or forecasting World War I. Lee's army had been dug in south of Petersburg, defending the route to Richmond. Grant's army dug in opposite him. And the city of Petersburg, which was adjacent to this siege line, was being shelled by these mortars, as well as the military forces under Lee. The results of that are described in the book, and I'm going to say repeatedly, I'm sure, that I don't have time to get into all the details as the book does, but one of the great narratives in the book is excerpts from a diary by a woman called Sarah Pryor, who lived in Petersburg, as did many other women, children, and old men, which was pretty much all that was left in Petersburg at the time it was being shelled by Grant's forces. And one of the very interesting things she says, or moving, I think, is that she and her small children were living under this barrage, and the first intelligible sound that was made by her infant daughter was the sound of a screaming artillery shell. So we, at least in the North, tend to forget the bitterness and the carnage that was taking place in the midst of this war, not just military but civilian. And Lincoln's challenge at this time in trying to bring people together and somehow get past this catastrophic tragedy and try to reconcile the country was challenged by that kind of animosity, distrust, anger that was rife throughout the South at the time. But it was not only in the South, but also in the North that Lincoln had issues to deal with and challenges to overcome. This is Horace Greeley, who some of you will have known, or not known probably, but heard of, who was the editor and owner of the New York Tribune, certainly the most powerful newspaper man of his day, the most influential. I like to think of him as the Walter Cronkite of the 1860s for a couple of reasons. One, he was, in fact, the most important news giver and opinionator of his time, but he also, just like Walter Cronkite, started out very much in favor of the war and then turned against it at about the time of the Hampton Roads Peace Conference because of these horrific casualties that were still being inflicted on both sides. We have to put this in perspective. In my generation, we lost a little over 50,000 Americans in Vietnam. The current estimate of the dead, only the dead in the Civil War, is over 700,000 out of a population 1/10 the size of our own. So you really can't conceive of the scope of this disaster. There really was literally not a family on either side of the war that didn't have a relative or a neighbor or a friend who had been lost in this horrific thing. And Horace Greeley and his wing, if you will, of the Republican Party was pressing Lincoln to find a way to end this carnage. On the other side of the Republican Party is Tommy Lee Jones here, otherwise known as Thaddeus Stevens, who was the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee and a leader of the Radical Republicans, which most of us will remember from high school or later, being very intense, anti-Southern, abolition, fierce advocates for a military victory in the war, and very much opposed to any kind of negotiation. Thaddeus Stevens said at one time on the floor of the House that after the war was won, the North would rule the South as England rules India. No political rights, no representation in Congress. Another line he used was that the southern states, had committed suicide when they seceded from the Union, and that they would not be let back in. There was talk about hanging, from Thaddeus Stevens, a baker's dozen of the Confederate leaders, which started a bidding war among how many Confederates were going to be hanged when this war was over. So this wing of Lincoln's own party is fiercely opposed to any kind of reconciliation, any kind of negotiation, as they saw it with the South on the ropes. The war is basically won. Why in the world would we start negotiating? On the other side of the line, Jefferson Davis. This photograph was taken when he was a United States Senator in the late 1850s. I don't have time to get into the details, but Davis is a fascinating figure that I think certainly where I come from, there's not much known about Davis. I think there's probably more known in the South, but he was, in a nutshell, a West Point graduate, had served in the United States Army as an officer for 7 years, was a wounded hero of the Mexican War, had been appointed to the Senate to fill a vacant seat, left, came back, and was one of the great political figures of his time, well regarded on both sides before the war, actually considered a presidential campaign, spoke in Boston and other places in the North and Maine, and was a very highly regarded figure before the war. After the war, Davis became probably the most embittered, intransigent political leader I have ever read about in American history. Again, don't have time to get into the details, but where others were saying that effectively the war had been lost, that the best deal that could be made should be made, Davis just refused to hear of it. His wife, Verena, I'm told is the right pronunciation. I had thought it was Verena, but I just learned an hour ago it's Verena, who loved him and was very supportive of him, said in her diary, which is also very interesting, or in memoirs, that her husband had a dyspeptic personality, is the way she put it, and was so thin-skinned that even a child's disapproval would discompose him. So we're talking about a military man, an honor-bound man, a stubborn, very difficult personality. And you don't have to take it just from me. Louis Wigfall was a member of the Confederate Senate, had served with Davis in the United States Senate, and was a leader of the anti-Davis wing in the Confederate Congress. We tend to think, at least in the North, of the Confederacy as a kind of monolith, where everybody had the same point of view and there was political unity. As a matter of fact, the Confederate Congress was at least as dysfunctional as our Congress today, if you can believe that. Louis Wigfall, this senator from Texas, went up on the floor of the Senate of the Confederacy in Richmond and described Jefferson Davis as an amalgam of malice and mediocrity. This is what he said in public. You can imagine what he was saying in private. So having gone through all of that series of things here, we set the stage for the tremendous difficulty of trying to find a way to bring these two sides together. There's terrific division within themselves. There's 4 years of bloody war between the two sides, and Lincoln is looking for some way to try to crack through that. Gideon Welles, Gideon Welles, Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy from Connecticut, who was said not to know which end of the ship goes out first, was a political appointee and has a terrific diary that's quoted frequently in the book, very incisive, very witty diary. And he says that on the eve of this peace conference, that Lincoln's big challenge, his big desire right now is to find a way to reconcile the two sides, bring the country back together, but who will he treat with, as Wells says, and how commence the work? He can't treat with Davis in his own mind because Davis is not a legitimate political power in the ideology of the North. He's a rebel. This is not a legitimate government. These are not people we can sit down with and negotiate as we would with a sovereign power. So how are we going to get around that? How can we solve this conundrum? The work began with this man, Francis Preston Blair, who was sort of the Clark Clifford of his day, for those of us who are old enough to remember Clark Clifford, an elder statesman who had advised and been trusted by 7 successive presidents on both sides, Democrats and Whigs, and later Republican Lincoln, a very influential, wealthy newspaper editor, the patriarch of Blair House. It still stands across the street from the White House. His country home out in the wilderness of Maryland was called Silver Spring, which is now inside the Beltway. And I always like to mention that his son, Montgomery Blair, who was Lincoln's Postmaster General, is the grandfather of Montgomery Clift, the actor. So all things come around. The unique position that Francis Preston Blair is in is as follows. He's close to Lincoln, as I said, a close advisor of Lincoln's. And he's also, believe it or not, a father figure to Jeff Davis. Blair came from Louisville, Kentucky, near Transylvania College, still Transylvania University today. And Blair had been sent there as a 14-year-old boy with a letter of introduction to Blair. Blair and his wife kind of took Jeff Davis under their wings, and he never left. Blair mentored his political career when he came to Washington. Blair's wife took Davis's wife under her wing socially. They were extremely close, vacationed together, really almost a father-son relationship. So Francis Preston Blair is in this kind of unique position to try to broker something between these two sides. And he proceeds to go across the street to the White House about Christmas time of 1864, and he tells Lincoln that, he reminds him of his relationship with Davis. And he says he wants to go to Richmond to try to broker a deal to end the war. And he begins to say what that plan is. Lincoln puts up his hand and says, if you want to go to Richmond, I won't stop you, but I don't want to know who you're going to talk to when you get there. I don't want to know what you're going to say. and you're going to have no authority from me whatsoever. A distant successor of Abraham Lincoln would call that plausible deniability. Lincoln knows exactly what Blair's going to do. He's going to go down and talk to Jeff about reconciling the two sides one way or another. But by not giving him any authority and not having him act for him, he can say that it's not his thing, it's not his idea, he's not responsible for it. Blair then proceeds to make the 3-day trip from D.C. to Richmond in the dead of winter, which is no easy task for a 75-year-old man. And on the way down, he meets at City Point, Virginia, with General Grant, who is in what's as close to a candid photograph as you're ever going to see in the Civil War in the middle of the picture there. You can see the general next to him rifling his newspaper there because it's not stop-action photography. In any case, Blair meets with Grant, who we knew everybody, on the way to Richmond, and tells Grant his plan to end the war. Grant immediately signs off on this. Grant is enthusiastic about the whole thing, stands behind it completely. Blair then moves on to Richmond to the Confederate Executive Mansion, which is still standing. This is a modern photograph of it. Highly recommend it if you ever go to Richmond. It's a perfectly restored, beautiful place. And he goes out on that veranda there, and the street is where the photo was taken. So the street is very close to the veranda. He goes up there. Davis and his wife come out on the veranda, and Verena embraces him on this veranda and says, "Oh, you old scoundrel, I'm overjoyed to see you." People passing by on the street hear this. They know who Frank Blair is. They certainly know who Jeff and Verena Davis are, and that something is up. Rumors hit the street immediately. Within hours, it's in Washington. The whole country is talking about what might be going on here. Nobody knows. Everybody's trying to guess. They then meet here in the dining room of the Confederate Executive Mansion. And after dinner, the children and Verena leave Jeff and Frank Blair alone. And Blair proceeds to tell Davis his secret plan to end the war. Another phrase that may seem familiar to some of you. It starts with Benito Juarez, the elected president of Mexico, the first democratically elected president of Mexico, the first Native American ever to hold a presidential position or a monarch's position or whatever of any country. Juarez was a Democrat with a small d, a populist very much in favor of the common man, the Indians, the sort of oppressed people of Mexico, very much opposed by the authorities in Mexico, the military, the church, the landowners, the sort of establishment figures, sort of the Bernie Sanders of his day. Juarez is also disliked intensely by the European powers because he's nationalized a lot of European wealth. He's threatening to cut off European monopolization of Mexican riches and gold and silver and such. And while the United States is in its civil war and distracted by that, in 1864, the Emperor Napoleon III of France sends an expeditionary force of about 35,000 French troops to Mexico to depose Benito Juarez, which they proceeded to do, and install as the Emperor of Mexico the Archduke Maximilian of Austria, who had never seen Mexico, had nothing to do with Mexico, but was now installed as a puppet dictator, basically, under the wing of Napoleon III. Neither the North nor the South is happy about this. It's sort of as if back in the Cold War, the Russians had sent, a 35,000-man expeditionary force into Mexico, taken over the country. We wouldn't be happy about it. James Monroe was rolling in his grave, but there wasn't much to be done about it with a civil war going on. So given all of that, Blair's plan, as he proceeds to explain it to Davis, is basically this. Lee will be clued in with Grant, only Lee and Grant, clued into a secret plan with Davis and Lincoln. Nobody else will know about it. And the essence of it is that Lee will withdraw his army southwest from Richmond in what he will put out as a retreat to more defensible positions. Grant will give him a couple of days head start and start pursuing Lee with his army as it moves across the Southwest. Once they get to the Rio Grande, Lee will cross over, followed by Grant. Lee will pick a fight with these 35,000 French troops. And together, the northern troops are certainly going to jump in on the side of their fellow Americans when they're embroiled in a war with a foreign country. They will beat the stuffing out of the French. They'll reunite on the old battlefields of Mexico. They'll embrace, they'll drink toasts, and peace and reconciliation will come as night follows the day. Now, what could possibly go wrong with a plan like that? Remarkably enough, instead of laughing him out of the room, Davis says he thinks this is an intriguing idea. This is really a new, insightful thing that he thinks he could get behind. While Blair is sort of ecstatic about this response, frankly quite surprised by it, he proceeds to visit around Richmond with old friends that he had known in Washington for 30 years or 40 years, one of whom is Davis's vice president, Alex Stevens, a brilliant mind in a tiny body. Alex Stevens was about 5 feet 4 inches tall and never weighed 100 pounds. He was chronically ill from any number of diseases that you can mention, always in poor health. One of his friends described him as a fugitive from a graveyard. Highly regarded on both sides, North and South, as a political mind, as an orator, had been very pro-union before the war, and had been brought in as vice president basically to sort of on a fusion ticket to kind of balance out Davis's secessionist camp with the unionist camp before the war, so that there'd be a kind of a representation of both points of view. Of course, once the war began and Georgia seceded, Stevens was very much a Confederate advocate, but never lost this thought that some way, sometime, someday, there would be a reconciliation one way or another. He met with Blair while Blair was in Richmond, as did many other Confederate leaders, and basically gave Blair to understand that there's got to be some way to resolve this. Davis is beyond discussion, but there's a long, strong body of reasonable people here who know which way this war is going and would be receptive to a way to get it ended. Blair then goes back to Washington, to Lincoln's White House here, and describes what had happened in Richmond. We don't know what Lincoln said about this Mexican pipe dream. We can surmise, knowing Lincoln, it was probably something like, that's very interesting, Preston, we'll talk about that later. But what he really wanted to know was more about this dissident movement in Richmond, because there was very little known about what was going on at high levels in Richmond at this time. And Lincoln is very much enthused by this thought that there's a kind of a cabal, as Davis called it, the cabal, with a capital T and a capital C, of political opponents in Richmond who were trying to find a way to get this thing over with. Lincoln then writes a letter to Blair, not to Davis. So again, he's not communicating directly to Davis, gives the letter to Blair to read to Davis. And the letter essentially says that you may tell Mr. Davis, and not by the way, President Davis, Mr. Davis, that I am willing to receive or send envoys to discuss with either him or any other influential person who can control the armies of the South. Essentially, what he's doing here is inciting a coup. If Davis won't talk to me, and there's no way to get him to the table, let's see if these dissidents are able to pull something off here to depose him, or at least to marginalize him, and get them to the table. He says then at the end of the letter that the purpose of this meeting would be with a view to bring peace to the peoples of our one common country. which is the title of the book. This letter was written in response to one from Davis that said he was willing to talk peace at any time to bring peace to the peoples of two countries. So this sort of irreconcilable position is where things start, and Davis then proceeds when he hears back from Blair. Blair makes a second trip to Richmond and tells Davis that Lincoln is willing to talk, but you saw the part about our one common country, Mr. Davis, and he's not interested in anything that involves two countries. Davis says, yes, I read that, as if you would have missed it, and says that nonetheless, he's ready to send some envoys to Lincoln to talk about this Mexican idea, which he still claims to be enamored of. He then selects 3 senior Confederate envoys to go to Lincoln. One is his vice president, Alex Stevens, who turns out to be, when the research is delved into, probably the fiercest political enemy that Jefferson Davis had. His own vice president was his strictest and fiercest critic, or certainly one of them. Davis had once referred to Stevens as the little pale star from Georgia, to which Stevens responded that Davis was an imbecile. And this again was on the floor of the Confederate Senate from his own vice president. We haven't quite got that far in Washington yet, but I think wait a day or two, maybe we will. But that's the kind of dissent or, division that there was within the Confederate government. But remarkably enough, Davis chooses Alex Stevens as the chairman of this peace delegation to Lincoln. Second member of that peace delegation is a very distinguished lawyer from Georgia, then living in Louisiana, who had been a justice of the United States Supreme Court by the name of John Campbell, a brilliant, brilliant mind, also a pro-union point of view before the war, had been, just to tell you in a nutshell, graduated from the Future University of Georgia at the age of 14, went on to West Point, became a lawyer, member of the Georgia Bar at the age of 18 by special act of the legislature, because you had to be 21 to be a lawyer, and is generally regarded on both sides as one of the great minds of his day. He too is an enemy politically of Davis, a critic of Davis. Davis appoints him to the number 2 spot as a delegate to Lincoln. The third member, Senator Robert Hunter of Virginia, yet another brilliant mind, had been elected to the United States House of Representatives at the age of 28 and was elected Speaker of the House at the age of 32. Still the youngest by far in history. Was part of the first graduating class at the University of Virginia with Edgar Allan Poe, which I think is the coolest thing that he did, and was also known on both sides as a highly respected, very bright, very capable man who had also been considered seriously as a presidential candidate in 1860, but yet again, another bitter critic of Jefferson Davis. So Davis appoints as his peace commission to go and try to end this war 3 of his most vociferous critics, all of whom were known to be that, and off they go to the Union lines south of Petersburg. They arrived there at this place known by its residents as Fort Hell. I think for obvious reasons. It was being shelled day and night, pickets being picked off one by one, sharpshooters rifling at each other day and night, a Union fort about 100 yards from the Confederate lines. When they arrive, Grant happens to be in North Carolina on some sort of mission to the Wilmington area where they're about to consolidate their gains there, and is not on the scene when these peace delegates arrive. They announce themselves to the Union officers there as having been sent by Davis to meet with Lincoln for the purpose of ending the war, and that General Grant knows what they're up to and expects them. Grant is not there. Grant's second in command wires up to Washington to Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who was the fiercest hawk in Washington, very much in the radical Republican wing, anti-negotiation of any kind. Stanton wires back to this second in command and says, you keep those Confederate delegates on their own side of the lines. I don't know anything about any peace mission. Don't let them through the lines until you hear otherwise from me. Meanwhile, however, this is a Union picket post in that no man's land, if you will. And if you see the men behind there, one man standing up at the right, this photo was taken right after the war, and the man on the right is standing on a Confederate picket post. So you can see how close they were to each other, sniping at each other all through the night. And then during the day, there was this kind of unofficial truce. They'd come out and trade tobacco for sugar, and newspapers would be exchanged, struck up friendships. At one point, a Confederate soldier threw a rock with a note tied around it over one of these barricades, and the note said, "Tell the fellow with the spyglass to put it down, or we will have to shoot him." What happens when the word comes out that these peace delegations have arrived is absolute pandemonium, and this is what drew me to the story to begin with. Reading Shelby Foote's trilogy, he talks about this, where these peace delegates arrive at this horrible place, and the Union troops and the Confederate troops think the war is over. They rush out into no man's land, they embrace each other, they're trading hats, they're singing, the band plays Dixie, and then the band plays Yankee Doodle, and then the band plays Home Sweet Home. There's this incredible outpouring of emotion. One of these Union soldiers said that if the generals didn't end the war, that they were going to end it right then and there. This was the kind of enthusiasm that there was for this. This photograph, I think, kind of sums it up. The Confederate on the left is a prisoner. You can see his West Point ring on his left hand. And his captor there is Lieutenant George Armstrong Custer. This is the kind of fraternization and, camaraderie that was going on at the time. Lincoln gets word, of course, that these Confederate delegates have shown up at the lines, and he knows what Jeff Davis is about and can't believe that this is a serious overture, but he's not closing the door on it. Maybe Blair has managed to do some magic after all. So he goes to his Secretary of State, William Seward. And Seward is very close to Lincoln. They were from opposite backgrounds. Seward's a rich aristocrat from upstate New York, very well educated. We know Lincoln's background, but they had become very close and trusting of each other. Lincoln sends Seward down to Virginia, to the Union fortress at Hampton Roads, Virginia, which had never changed hands, still there today, at the mouth of the James River, and has these Confederate troops brought to Hampton Roads to be vetted, if you will, by Seward, see if they really are sincere about the prospect of reconciliation and reunion. I don't have time to get into it now, but one of the terrific storylines in the story, expounded at length in the book, is Grant's role in this, and it's really quite astonishing. The most surprising thing I saw in the story. Effectively, Grant maneuvers around Stanton, his boss, to get Lincoln to agree to this meeting by sitting down with the Confederates in their cabin on his personal steamer after throwing a big dinner party for them with all of his generals, and works with them to try to figure out language that will get them past Stanton and get Lincoln to meet with them. Long story that I don't have time to tell, but really quite amazing, including shutting down the telegraph wires when the orders are coming through to keep them on the other side of the lines. Pretty amazing. In any case, Seward goes down, is sent down to meet with these Confederates to vet them out. At the very moment that Lincoln is writing an instruction to Seward to go down to Hampton Roads, the House of Representatives is about to vote on the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. And as those of you who saw the movie may recall, a tremendous struggle there. The Senate had already passed, endorsed the amendment. The House was a very close call. It was going to go either way. Nobody really knew how it would turn out. The Republicans were unanimously for it. Democrats were pro-Southern, or at least Southern sympathizer. by and large. And they had managed to cajole and buy and threaten enough Democrats so that it was a close call. They didn't know how it was going to go. The rumor hits the House floor that Confederate peace delegation is down at Hampton Roads and about to come up to Washington. In fact, I misspoke just now. The rumor is that they're in Washington, that the Confederate delegates are in Washington and meeting with Lincoln. This rumor ripples across the House floor. The floor manager of the vote, the pro-amendment vote, writes a letter to Lincoln, a note really, that says the rumor is on the floor that Southern peace negotiators are in Washington meeting with you. And if you can't dispel that rumor, we're going to lose this vote, because the Democrats are starting to go the other way. They're saying if Davis wants to reconcile and negotiate peace, the last thing we're going to do is abolish slavery and drive him away. So they're going to lose this vote unless you can dispel this rumor that the rebel negotiators are in Washington. The messenger comes to the White House. Lincoln, while he's writing the note to Seward, reads the note from the Hill, turns it over and writes on the back, "As far as I know, no Confederate peace delegates are in Washington or about to come here. A. Lincoln." And then he proceeds to finish sending the letter to Seward to go down to Hampton Roads and talk with them there. Honest Abe, as I say in the book. The vote takes place literally as the Southern Peace Commissioners are coming across the lines at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the same hour as the vote is taking place, so that the telegram can't get up there and tell people what's happening. And the vote to abolish slavery or to endorse the amendment, doing so, carries in the House by 2 votes, which it certainly would not have done had it not been for that little piece of deception. Lincoln, meanwhile, makes a determination after Grant does the whining and dining that I mentioned before, and Seward wires back to Lincoln telling him that he thinks these folks actually are sincere about meeting and discussing reconciliation. Grant puts it in a way that's not quite untrue, but as close to untrue as you can get, convinced that if they just get to a table and talk to each other, something might happen. Another candid photo of Grant with his officers. In the lower left corner is Meade leaning over Grant, who's got a map in front of him, and the others are all these generals that had met with these 3 Confederate negotiators while they were at Grant's headquarters. Many of them knew each other. As I said, they had this tremendous dinner party that went till like 2 in the morning, whining and dining these Confederates in the middle of a Civil War. It's really quite extraordinary. The Confederates then move on to Fort Monroe here at Hampton Roads, and they gather on a steamboat in the harbor there called the River Queen, which is essentially the presidential yacht, Lincoln's steamboat that he uses for his travels and for meetings, sort of the Air Force One of its time. This portrait here is painted of Lincoln, Grant, Sherman, and Admiral Porter, the head of the Union Navy. And the reason it's significant is that it takes place in the salon, as they called it, where the meeting took place between Lincoln, Seward, and the 3 Confederate negotiators. Quite a plush accommodation, as you can see. The generals met with Lincoln about a month later in the same place, and that too is discussed in the book, but this is the setting of the conference. Seward and Lincoln, meanwhile, had come up with a plan of what they're going to present to the Southern delegation here. Again, we've got Alex Stevens in the upper left corner, Davis's vice president, Senator Hunter in the lower left, Justice Campbell in the lower right, the 3 Confederates, Seward in the upper right, and Lincoln. The plan essentially is a carrot and stick, and I'll get into that in just a minute. And I've got to move quickly here because we don't have time for anything like the detail. But I will tell you, I think, an interesting prelude to this. The 5 of them gather for the first time since the war in this steamboat salon. They all knew each other. Most of them had been friends in all sorts of interlocking ways. Seward had served in the Senate with Hunter for 12 years. Lincoln had been a close friend of Stevens in the House of Representatives back in the 1840s. They had both been against the Mexican War, which was not a popular place to be, and had formed a real friendship. 6'4" Lincoln and 5'4" Stevens, kind of an odd couple. Campbell had attended Lincoln's inauguration as a justice of the Supreme Court. He had been to the White House. They'd had conversations. So these people all knew each other. They'd been friends to one degree or another for years before the war. Now you've got to picture the scene as they sort of meet each other for the first time after 4 years of this horrible catastrophe with 700,000 dead, as the leaders of the two sides of these enemy camps. Very awkward, to say the least, and a kind of a strained situation. So Lincoln takes a chance, as I say in the book. Stevens comes in with his 95-pound body swathed in about 3 scarves, a shawl or 2, and this heavy-duty homespun southern wool coat, a product of the blockade. And it looks like he's gained about 50 pounds. So Lincoln is kind of taken aback, and he thinks, my God, you must be eating better than I thought that they were in the South. Look at Alex Stevens. Stevens takes off the coat and the shawls, and there's the 95-pound Alex Stevens. And this is all while they're kind of shaking hands, but sort of not knowing what to say. Lincoln says to the assembled group, you know, I must say, that's the smallest ear and the biggest shuck that I've ever seen in one time and place. Happily for the cause of diplomacy, Stevens leads the laughter. Everybody kind of relaxes, and they sit down for half an hour and just talk about the old days, remembering, characters from Georgia and Connecticut. And Seward is a very close friend of Jefferson Davis before the war. He's asking sympathetically about Davis's health. Convey my best regards to Mr. Davis. The Southerners are reminiscing about John Quincy Adams in the House of Representatives. It's all this kind of old-time week. So after about a half an hour of that, it's almost as if nobody really wants to break the spell of this because it's much more pleasant than what they have to deal with. Finally, little Alex Stevens says, well, Mr. President, and I think this is carefully planned words. Well, Mr. President, is there any way for us to get back to those pleasant days when there were good relations between the two sections of the country? It doesn't say, the two countries. It says the two sections of the country. It's sort of halfway to our one common country. And if Stevens is expecting some sort of extravagant endorsement of this Mexican plan, he's deeply disappointed, because Lincoln says in very clipped, short sentences, there's only one way I know of, and that's for the forces who are resisting the authority of the United States to stop. There's a kind of a pall falls over the room because the message there is very tough and very clear. Again, I don't have time to get into it in detail at all, but the essence of it is that for the first hour or so, Seward and Lincoln bring out the stick. They talk about the movement in the North among very serious, very tough men who want to hang the entire Confederate leadership, 3 of whom are sitting in the room. They talk about the military situation, the imbalance of forces, the fact Lincoln says that he will not negotiate with armed rebels. They have to put down their arms before there'd be any kind of negotiation. Senator Hunter then, at the lower left there, says at one point, well, Mr. President, there's a precedent for this in history. Charles I negotiated with rebels in the English Civil War. So Lincoln pauses for a moment and he says, I don't know much about history. You have to talk to Seward about that. But what I do remember about the case is that Charles lost his head. After about a half an hour of this kind of hardball stick approach, they gradually start working into the carrot. And again, putting this in a nutshell, Lincoln basically offers 3 or 4 inducements to them to end this war on peaceful terms. 2 of them have to do with slavery, ironically enough. One is that Seward alludes to the fact that now that we've passed the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, it's got to be ratified by the states. And there are 34 states in the Union. By that he means the whole Union. And he doesn't have to go on to say that 11 of those states are Confederate. You have to pass a constitutional amendment by a 3/4 majority. So the sort of inducement there is, come on back into the Union, and we have to get this thing ratified. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. Next thing Lincoln says is that he will pardon all of the Confederate leaders by executive order, which he has the power to do. He says, except for Mr. Davis, who has repeatedly says he doesn't want a pardon, and I'm not about to force one on him. Third thing he will do is go to Congress with a proposal, which he can only make, he's not the king. He will go to Congress with a proposal to compensate the southern states for the emancipation of the slaves in the amount of $400 million. Just serious money in 1865. And the last thing that he will do is personally put his political capital behind the destruction of this notion of kind of conquering the South, dominating the South. The southern states will come back with all their political rights back into the Senate, back in the House. The country will be united politically and otherwise. Long story short, this is a 4-hour meeting and a long, long chapter in the book, but the essence of it is that the meeting ends inconclusively. There's not a yes, there's not a no. Both sides are going to adjourn to their respective sides and see what they can do to try to bring something together. At the very end, Lincoln asks says to Stevens, well, Stevens, there's been nothing we could do for our country today. Is there anything I can do for you personally? Stevens says, I can't think of anything. Then he does think of something. He's got a nephew who's a prisoner of war in this godforsaken prisoner of war camp up in Ohio, and he asks Lincoln to free his nephew. Lincoln says he'll be glad to do it. Just send me back, a northern lieutenant of the same rank, and you've got it. So they end on a kind of a brotherly note. Seward, famously at the time, says, God bless you, Hunter, to his friend, Senator Hunter. Hunter asks about the Capitol dome, which had been incomplete. At the time he left, is it finished? Yes, it is. They sort of embrace. There's tears in their eyes. It's a very kind of moving thing. So the two sides break up and go home. 2 days later, Lincoln convenes his cabinet on Sunday at the White House and proposes to them essentially the plan that I just described, to get their support to go to Congress, to put this proposal before Congress and try to get a reconciliation of the two sides based on that plan. Lincoln's Secretary of the Interior, an old friend named John Usher from Illinois, says later that if one member of the cabinet had supported him on this, he is convinced that Lincoln would have done it, but not a single member of Lincoln's own cabinet endorses the idea. Political suicide, they say, and no doubt they were right. If you kind of think about it, here the war is as good as won. The North is on the verge of a military victory, and now we're going to go to the Congress and the people of the North and say we're going to pardon all these traitors, as they saw it. We're going to give them $400 million for these slaves. We're going to welcome them back as if nothing had happened. And these 400,000 Northern boys who are dead, and probably 1 million who are maimed and wounded and mentally crippled for life, put it in the past. Nobody, not a single member of Lincoln's cabinet would stand behind him in that effort. Lincoln then writes on the back of the proposal that he had written, words to the effect, on this 5th day of February, 1865, I proposed this reunification plan to my cabinet, and not a single member supported me. I think of it as a kind of a letter to posterity. He stands up, he says, you are all against me, folds up the note, puts it in his jacket, and walks out. Davis, meanwhile, springs what I think of and describe in the book as the trap that he had set up for this whole operation. These three peace negotiators, all three of whom are his political enemies, all three of whom have been doves, if you think of hawks and doves, come back to Richmond empty-handed and tell him that Lincoln won't negotiate until we put down our arms. Davis anticipated something like this, leaves out in this convocation that he calls in Richmond, the biggest room in Richmond, ironically, is the African church, the black church in town, which seats the most people. He calls the citizens of Richmond together in the African church, gives this stem-winder speech, which he was excellent at doing. It basically says, Abraham the first has now laid down the law to us that he will not talk to us until we put down our arms and grovel at his feet. This is Southern manhood being challenged. We will fight to the last man and boy before we submit to that kind of autocracy. There is an outpouring of support for Davis in Richmond, where it had been at a low ebb before, and that outpouring of enthusiastic support lasts about 3 days, at the end of which people settle back to empty tables, empty chairs at their dinner tables from their sons and husbands, 14-year-old boys in the trenches, and 70-year-old men populating much of the Army of Northern Virginia. As we all know, the denouement here, Lee eventually has to give up the defense of Richmond, retreats with his Army of Northern Virginia. Grant pursues him, catches him out near Appomattox. Lee surrenders. Richmond falls to the north. And even then, Lincoln goes down to Richmond, as some of you may know, 2 days after the Confederate government flees. And even then, he meets with Judge Campbell, one of those three negotiators, separately, and tells Campbell that if the South will write reunion and abolition at the top of a page, you can write anything you want on the rest of that page. That too falls to nothing. There's nobody left to negotiate with. The Davis government is basically dissolved. Lee has surrendered. The South is in disarray. Lincoln's hope and plan was to bring the Virginia legislature back into session, ask them to vote Virginia back into the Union by Democratic vote, hope to do the same in other legislatures throughout the South, so that there could be the beginnings of some kind of voluntary political reunion rather than a military conquest. We all know what happened very soon thereafter at Ford's Theater. This is a contemporary photograph. You can see that kind of ghostly sentry in the balcony. What we don't know until we read the book is that in the middle of the second act, there's a knock at the back of the box there with a messenger coming in. The messenger has a wire from Richmond, from Judge Campbell and Senator Hunter, who are still down in Richmond. And they wire Lincoln that they're ready to sit down with Lincoln and talk about this plan to avoid bitterness and hatred and try to find a way to reconcile the two sections. Lincoln reads the note, hands it back to the messenger, and says, "I'll deal with this tomorrow." I should give credit where credit is due. This is the website that produces these terrific color images. Nothing to do with me. I don't get a piece of it. But I recommend it highly. It's called CivilWarInColor.com. There is an audio book for those of you who may be interested in that. And that is my story. I thank you very much.
It is an incredible story. We have a little time for questions. If anyone has a question. Yes, sir, right here. The microphone coming right at you.
What role did Andrew Johnson, Vice President to Lincoln, play in any of this?
None. Lincoln treated Johnson basically not with contempt, but with isolation. He never dealt with Johnson on anything to speak of. Some of you may know Johnson gave a drunken speech on Inauguration Day, and his political capital didn't fare well after that. Yes.
Your comment.
I do.
Your comment about Lincoln reading the note at Ford's Theater reminded me of could have taken place had Lincoln lived?
Well, I get asked that question a lot, and of course, counterfactual, you never can say, what would have happened and didn't. But I think that, I was saying earlier to Skip that I think that the one thing that most likely could have led to a fruitful negotiation would have been if Robert E. Lee had stood behind it. He was by far the most respected, revered, really, figure in the South at the time. Davis had a very shattered political base and was not, in a position really to lead the South into peace, even if he wanted to, and he didn't. But if Lee had, I think that would have made a huge difference. And secondly, I think that if Lincoln had lived, he would have put all of his chips out on the table as far as trying to get the Congress to endorse some kind of resolution along these lines. The war had been won militarily by then. In fact, Lincoln at one point said that Grant seemed to be getting Virginia out of the war a lot better than he was. But by the time he was shot, the war was still on. General Johnston hadn't surrendered yet. There were still pockets of resistance elsewhere. And I think the South could have kept, the dignity of sitting down at a table with military forces in the field if Lee had come forward with that and if Lincoln had used his political capital.
Any other questions? Well, it's a fascinating story. I've read about it, but I have not read this book, but I intend to read this book. And I want to thank Jim Conroy for coming to the Clinton School, and please come visit with him as he signs this book. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you
Jim,
again.
thank you.